Always be Purpurea. So say if one of the later Purpureas is like, oh, I think Purpurea venosa should be a different species. When it comes down to the split up, you would split off venosa. Purpurea will always stay Purpurea. However, it makes talking about this really confusing because, like, if I say perp, am I talking about all of them or just this one? Or do I just start saying perp like I'm a Pokemon? I don't know. It is a little, yeah. So notable. This is Purpurea is by far just the widest spread Sarracenia. It's the most successful Sarracenia. New Jersey up to Canada. It's actually not even done expanding. Ecology work is it's post-ice age and just kind of continuing to creep through Canada. It's also invasive in parts of Europe. Ireland, Great Britain, and some random spots in like Switzerland. It's been introduced and is kind of a problem. So it's truly is the most like hardy and successful Sarracenia. Now, this will make a bit more sense as we get into the others, but it's always, these plants always look really similar, so it's just like, how do you even tell them apart? Because the one thing I'll say is, if you ever acquired a Purpurea and you don't know what it is, it's probably not this one, despite the fact it's the Canada one, and everyone's like, oh, it's super cold hardy. The main thing, honestly, the easiest simple tell in context is just fuzz. It's the only one that's hairless, really. If there are hairs, they're very short. You don't even feel them. Versus when you like put your hand to like any of the other Purpureas, they have kind of a felt texture to them. The other detail too is that the hoods are just kind of comparatively smaller. If you try pinching them together, they kind of barely touch or struggle to touch. Versus like a lot of the other ones, they're huge. It's no problem putting them together. And little thing to pay attention to is the flowers, because that'll come a bit more later. Their flowers are also the darkest. They're still red, and fun fact, they smell like roses, but they're often like a deep maroon purple when compared to, well, the other ones. Now, each one of these forms, I've put a grower's anecdotes. These are things, they're just hard to cite. It's just when you talk to growers, it's like, yep, that's it. It's hard to get. One thing that doesn't really have easy, good, clean, scientific sources is the cold tolerance of all these. This is the Canada one. It is the most cold tolerant of all of them, but it's not invincible. You can kill it. If any Sarracenia, if you put it in a tiny pot and you say like put it on a table in the winter and let it dry out, that'll just kill it. You can kill these overwintering. Hard to do, so it's an accomplishment, but you can do it. And other things. Seed stratification with Sarracenia seeds, you're supposed to keep them cold and wet for a month before they sprout. It's a safety check so the plants don't accidentally sprout in the fall, because fall is pretty similar to spring. So this is the only Sarracenia where 6 weeks is recommended. Every other Sarracenia, even the other Purpureas, 4 weeks is fine. This is the only one where 6 weeks is the tip. Also, it seems to struggle with heat, both from experience and watching growers from like Florida and South California complain. Prolonged heat, it seems to not be happy. It seems prone to rot. And when we had that heat wave last year, mine all sort of like frayed a bit. They didn't look happy, but then they got better, which is sort of interesting, but makes sense that it's from a colder climate. Might also be connected to dormancy. If you give it a cold dormancy, maybe it'll shrug the heat off better. That is something I've seen with various, well, just plants that have dormancy in general. The deeper the rest they get, the better they tolerate hardship. Anyway, I've seen these in person. In college, I had a program where in essentially May and June, I was up in Itasca, Mississippi headwaters. We went to a bog and we saw them. Lovely little things. Bogs are wonderful. They're like a water mattress. Like, it's sort of a magical place to be in. When it's cloudy. When it's sunny, the humidity spikes and you wish you weren't there. But when it's cloudy, it's just fun to romp through and trip in and get completely drenched because the floor is water. Just lovely. I do remember there were sundews. There was lots of, there were cranberries was one thing that stood up. Oh yes, I forgot. Deer. Apparently deer love these. Every single plant we found had a picture. It was a bite taken out by deer, which was unexpected. I know Itasca has been doing some research on deer ecology. That's a whole rabbit hole. Also, extra fun note, I have an online friend who lives in Newfoundland, that funny island off the coast of Canada. And here we are right away. And of course he talked to me like, hey, wait, aren't these like your funny plants? This is from a lovely little park. They have the statue here. This is him. According to his PR agents have told me to tell you he's no longer bald. And yeah, I also just love too is like they look just like the Minnesota ones. Supposedly Perp has the least variation of all of them because it's the youngest form. Also, Newfoundland has a complex history. It wasn't a part of Canada till like very recently, past 70 years or so. Before they were part of Canada, they had their own currency where they put Purpurea on it. Look at that lovely penny. Anyway, moving on. Now, this is a Purpurea you probably have. This is probably the most common. This is venosa. And I didn't say it before, but Latin. Purpurea means purple. It's the purple picture. Venosa means veined. And honestly, it's one of those generic terms you can kind of tell the taxonomist is like, yep, we need a word for this. Don't know what. So they just called it veined for the nice color patterning. This is the East Coast one. New Jersey-ish, we'll get there, down to Georgia, just barely. Like there's very isolated pocket in Georgia. Anyway, unlike Perp, which is totally isolated, this does overlap with other Sarracenia species. Maybe I have my count off, but I was kind of surprised it's only 3. As for the general characteristics, and this is supposed to be shared by a lot of the others, is it's got the bigger lid and it's fuzzy, which is what we kind of went over earlier. It's also more rotund. I kind of forgot to say that. Perp is kind of the lankiest in general, so it kind of lank out. Now, and there are some border cases too where you'll find a plant, you're like, wait, this doesn't quite fit. It kind of looks like Purpurea. We will get there. As for growers' anecdotes, it's the one you have probably because 1, it's prettier, 2, it fits the East Coast climate, so there's more people along the East Coast than the far north, that kind of thing. And it's still very cold tolerant. It's found alongside flava and yet reportedly is a little hardier than flava, for example. It's just not Hudson Bay winter, far north Minnesota, any of that cold. Anyway, as for that, there's an intergrade zone. This is common with plants and even animals. They say something about snakes having like intergrade color patterns, but anyway. The formal definition, if you dig into old paperwork, is perp is places that were glaciated, whereas venosa is places that weren't glaciated. Reality, as nature doesn't care, is a bit of a mess. The intergrade zone is sort of New Jersey through Virginia. So specifically, I also want to specify these aren't like direct hybrids. These are like population of mixed traits. In the intergrade zone, you'll find plants that look like Purpurea, that look like venosa, look kind of in between. It's kind of here be madness trying to define stuff. Also, at least when I started, it's also basically St. Louis's climate. It is just a tiny bit warmer. I was checking, it's like, oh. But it being close to our climate kind of explains some of the oddities I've seen in growing, because intergrades are what happens when you get, like, it makes sense. Purpurea is the far north, likes it cold. Venosa likes it warmer. This is that kind of intermediate area that's cold, but still pretty warm. So just kind of like, that's how it shakes out. Now, on to the interesting stuff. Purpurea, the current formal rankings, Purpurea subspecies venosa variety Montana. I know we're getting there. It is the rarest Purpurea by far, only in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is a little bit essentially North Carolina, but technically crosses into South Carolina and Georgia. It is the rarest Purpurea. It's not formally endangered, but trying to check into records, it probably should be considered at least vulnerable or something like that. It's pretty rare. Its only neighboring Sarracenia is Jonesii, which is critically endangered, which is interesting and kind of a hint at the habitat struggles. Now, the general formal diagnostic, if I think I see this here, I can grab this, right? Yeah. So generally, what the papers are claiming is that the hood encloses more. It's got that gnome hat look. That's what everyone loves about Montana and the like. It just kind of comes to that point. So an interesting thing is there's also descent of, it might not be consistent. One or two populations, it's super consistent, but other ones in the mountains, it's not. Overlook thing, and I have no say on how consistent that is supposedly the hairs in the lid are shorter on Montana. I've seen almost no one like discuss or compare that, so it's just kind of like, huh, I didn't know. So, of course, there's a question of why do we call it different? And one, mountain ecology. Two, genetics do kind of put it in an intriguing spot when you take a look at it, but that is something we will get to later. As for growers' anecdotes that are kind of interesting, this is the pretty one. Pretty is not taxonomy. It's kind of, there's specific individuals that people have selected and grown out. That's not what all of them look like, but certain Montana people go crazy for, which is like grab some growers' plants. Reportedly, they're a bit smaller, slower growing. They also have the heat intolerance, a bit like Purp. They don't, once again, it's Florida and South of California people complaining because they get it hot. But it's supposedly a little bit less fond of heat. Might, once again, it's that dormancy thread. Also, the gnome hat, the lid enclosing thing, something I've kind of noticed and seen others point out is that seems to be a bit conditional. All Purpurea types will actually enclose their lid a bit. Like this here is mine, and this was in the middle of like August when it was like a drought, and the first time I'd ever seen it like do this for me, where it just kind of closed to a point. However, it doesn't go quite as far as Montana. And yes, as I do like to point out, mountain bogs are pretty crazy places. Well, they do have normal bogs like that one there. A really cool environment is the cataract bog, which is just a sheer rock slope that's just running water, and that's where these plants are found. Along the edge of the rock and in any cracks, plant material accumulates. And in that plant mass, the pitcher plants grow. This is also how Jonesii grows. Notably, it's a very treacherous environment. There's very little soil, so heavy rain will just wash plants away at time. And if anything disrupts the water flow and it dries out, they're just gone. They have no like soil, deep soil to sort of reside in for water. They're just down and out, which is part of why it is mountain plants are endangered. Other part is land development. We'll get there. Anyway, on to my favorite one, and there's actually two competing names for this. It's either distinct species, Sarracenia rosea. Rose is Latin for pink. Most European languages use rose to mean pink. English is weird in that we call it pink instead of rose, but it's the pink or rose pitcher plant. The other is subspecies Venosa variety Burkii, which is Burke's pitcher plant. This is the Gulf Coast Sarracenia. It's hot, it's muggy, it's the deep south. This is the crazy Sarracenia hotspot. There's more Sarracenia species in this sort of stretch of coast than basically anywhere else. There's kind of too many to list and a lot of confusing stuff. This one, I will also point out, this is the one that actually is the most standout. This is one you can actually see a picture and go, wait a minute, I think I recognize that. There's basically two diagnostics. One, absurdly thick lip. Like, that is actually statistically proven. And two is the flowers are different. They're pink, they're on shorter stalks, the petals are larger and rounder, which is kind of interesting. And also I mentioned sort of the flowers earlier, all the other ones are red. As for grower, this one loves heat. Unlike the others, this is just like, if you can roast it, it's happy. Its love of heat and coming from Florida means it has a short winter, so it's probably the best for growing indoors on a windowsill. Its natural dormancy is like a month long. Other notes, in terms of cultivars, the roundest cultivars, because people love those, tend to be rosea. There's round ones and the other varieties, but people love rosea. And there are some amusing cultivar names that I can't list in polite society. And also the largest Purpurea tend to be rosea, even kind of like this one kind of here, like There's specific locations, and generally breeding with it makes big plants. Probably could be one part hybrid ancestry, one part it just comes from the far south, longer growing season, so it's just more able to do that. I'm bringing this up as a sort of, don't freak out if you see these named, because these are technically named when it's not super relevant. They're forms, which is an actual taxonomic rank of just, it looked different, okay? Literally, anthocyanin is the pigment responsible for red and pink in plants. And we know from breeding, anthocyanin 3 is a recessive trait. It's probably a single gene that's just broken. So it's also shared between species, which is because there are anthocyanin-free forms of other species. They are named, I never remember them. Heterophylla, luteola, and pallidiflora. They all have a different name too, so it's like, anthocyanin-3 Montana has not been found, which is interesting. But this is because online people will list and describe stuff, and you're like, so what's this? It's that. I also love bring up hybrids. I think they're quite lovely. They do kind of struggle to exist because they're the rain-fed pitchers, but are often hybridized with the tall trumpets. They fill with rain and immediately flop over. It's do okay, but it is kind of a reality of how they exist. I do also want to mention something you see with Sarracenia. It has the Notho species concept. Naturally occurring hybrids get names, which is a little, why is that? It's because in nature, there's no record keeping. You don't know who mom and dad were. You also don't know how deep the hybridization was. Is it between two species, or was one parent itself a hybrid, or so on? Like one of my plants here, it actually kind of fits. This would be a Micheliana formerly. It's 75% rosea. At distance, you might even go like, oh, that's just a Purpurea, but it's kind of, there's little hints, like it's a little upright. You can sort of see the leucophylla white spots. The lid ruffles a little more than you'd expect. That's kind of why the label's used, because you'll see a plant in nature like, that's probably a hybrid. Don't know how much, but it is. And also, you'll sometimes see people talk about introgression. It's like when someone's great-great-great-grandma was a different species, there'll be traits in species that are kind of like, that looks a bit like another species. Color forms in particular are kind of a rabbit hole of this. Most of the flava varieties are thought to be different forms of introgression, which is a sort of rabbit hole. And just good example of the two most common you'll hear about are Cat's-Bee and Micheliana. And I also like this wild photo because, one, they occur in nature. Two, they flop over in nature. It's just part of their life. Also, I kind of skimmed over the names. Micheliana is cross leucophylla. Cat's-Bee is cross flava. If you consider rosea a distinct species, then technically cross flava for that would be Naxii. It's, be honest, people kind of don't really follow the namings regiment a lot. Especially, I think, like Micheliana is especially confusing because that's supposedly only rosea in nature, yet you'll see people use that for, like, just don't worry about it. If you see that name, that's roughly what it means. And then there's intervarietals. These plants are already admittedly pretty similar. So of course, when you cross them together, you get pretty plants, but all those identifying characters kind of go out the window. Abandon hope, you have no idea. Like this here is, I think, from Matt, is like Cherawa, which is, I think, rosea, and then the other parent was of Montana venosa. Kind of just looks like a really big rosea. But, and that's just, you wouldn't know that without keeping track of the records. Why you should label your plants. And also, I see it come up a lot. One of the mass-produced retail stores is thought to be a rosea by venosa. That's why it's always confusing when people ask, what is it? I don't know. So, up next is I wanted to go into taxonomy of what's the deal with Rosea berkii. This is kind of a rabbit hole of I'm going to have to compress, I'm going to go over a lot of taxonomy fundamentals, which means a lot is compressed. It's basically a college semester's worth of stuff in 20 minutes. Yeah, if things seem a little rushed or confusing, I tried. So anyway, like, what is the deal with plants? How hard could it be to tell apart plants? Oh my God, how I do hate species and varieties. Why is that a quote? Charles Darwin. Yeah, so one of the leading figures in the man who described evolution, which is critical for understanding taxonomy. He was a bit of a complainer. He loved to just whine about his life's passions, if you ever read into it. Whine and complain in letters how wretched something was, and then he spent the next 3 years of his life learning every part of it. Relatable. So, taxonomy is our attempt to make sense of chaos. We classify everything. Generally, when we classify it, we also try to build a family tree called a phylogeny to try and show the relationship. Should mention, annoying, family is a term in taxonomy, it's a group of genuses, but I'm also using family as a casual. It's a family tree. Anyway, one thing to note is, well, the phylogenies, there's actually some pretty good ways to build that pretty scientifically and robustly. The end labels, nature doesn't care. The labels are often opinion because there's often just, it's difficult to just kind of decide where an endpoint is. Boundaries are fuzzy in nature. Nature isn't, you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole with taxonomy, which is then the next question, why do we care? Because it lets us talk about this stuff. If we just kind of hand wave all this as just Purpurea, we wouldn't be able to kind of talk about the little differences and the climate and locale and the little behaviors and stuff like that. It'd just be, yeah, that's Purpurea. Next. I mean, there's more there. Bad news, and if you've ever wondered why it's so terrible, there is no definition for a species. There's like a dozen definitions that are in competition with each other because they don't universally fit. So the broadest is a population of similar organisms. Subspecies or varieties are subpopulations of those similar organisms. What's a subpopulation? Does it feel different but not different enough? There you go. We're going to look over the four most popular taxonomic species definitions of biologic, morphological, ecological, phylogenetic. First up, biologic. This is what I learned in high school. This is what I saw in the textbooks. Is if two populations do not interbreed, they're a distinct species. Hybrids are permitted if they're rare. Now, problem. As you saw earlier, Sarracenia hybridized. Sarracenia love to hybridize. In fact, this definition is almost kind of bunk for plants because plants hybridize so frickin' much that outside of some of the weird groups that do kind of split off on that, which of course that's why there's multiple definitions for a species. So it's like, okay. Now, an interesting note is this does include isolation. And Montana and Rosea are isolated from the other Purpureas. So under this definition, they would be deemed distinct just out of isolation. However, one thing that is always at the back of my mind is that map right there. It's estimated that in the US South, 97.5% of all Sarracenia habitat has been destroyed, which is a shocking number to hear about, especially with there's still a good number of Sarracenia left, just nowhere near as much as there were. But Georgia in particular was bad with development. Like I think Leucophylla essentially went extinct in Georgia, save for a single plant that was saved, stuff like that. And that's why I look at that ominous Georgia hole where Rosea and Venosa almost meet, like, huh. So we don't actually know if these two are truly isolated from each other or if it's just human interference and bad record keeping. Morphologic species is pretty intuitive. If it looks different, it is different. This would mostly apply to Rosea. And one thing to emphasize, you need consistency. You need like a shared origin. A freak individual is not a new species. It has to be something that a population shares. There are actually like so-called wastebasket taxons where people will point out to kind of lump together, oh, this is the largest member of this population. This is a different variety, when that doesn't quite fit. Now, one thing too is you also have to consider conditional variation, like there's a great example. This is a light-starved rosea. It looks pretty different. The ala are huge on it because it's trying to get more light. It's a little lankier, but funnily enough, the giant lip is still present. That's just an example. And that there is from the paper describing rosea. It's admittedly comparing purpurea to rosea, but it's kind of looking at like the flower petal difference. And also graphs from the paper of statistic separation of notably, like this one was trying, because climate can be an argument for differences in morphology because it's like, well, it's just warmer, that's why it grows bigger or whatever. But here's a fun one. It shows that like the flower height has like no trend with climate, but rosea is just kind of separate. Rosea has a pretty separate, decent separation here in comparing the scape length and lip thickness. It's a bunch of statistics of, though there are little regions of overlap, which is the whole point of boundaries do get fuzzy. You do find it, on the lip sync, you do find extreme examples in both. You can find like venosa, they'll have a sick one where it's like just one individual. And you'll find like a rosea that's in. This emphasis is consistency. So one individual doesn't invalidate the whole idea. Notably, color is actually a terrible character for morphology. It's considered the weakest trait to look at. It can be part of the puzzle, like rosea being consistently pink. But interestingly, there are dark-petaled rosea from a single known population. They still have traits, though, like shorter flower, larger petal, large lip. So it overall lines up. It's just its coloration is different. And you can also kind of see the variety in the flower color here. And my insane note is I think these dark petals are still different from like venosa and like, because they're still pink purple. They're not like red to maroon. Because in plants to get that red color, you need a yellow pigment. And well, you can even see it there. Rosea just doesn't really have the yellow. It's just white underneath, which is interesting. I keep saying that. Now, this is probably the broadest, best definition for making sense of the Chaosids sericina, the ecologic species. Species are defined by the niche they occupy. Niche, vague, but it's just some way of living that's distinct. Prey capture, light requirement, like Purpurea are shorter, so they need less light. Wetness and soil preference, there's some sericina that grow drier than others. Temperature tolerance, which we mentioned was the varieties. And pollinator attraction, because the flowers, big thing is a lot of sericina actually have different flowers to try and avoid cross-pollination. That's why they're all different colors and scents and flower timings and all that. They're trying to reduce interbreeding, which that's kind of in the biologic definition. It's fuzzy, overlapping, contradictory definitions. It's fun. And this Purpurea is actually a perfect example of how the hybridization, everything just squares away. Of Purpurea hybrids are terrible at existing. They fill with water and flop over. So you can imagine if those survive the breed, any offspring they have that resemble one of the parents more will likely do better. So they'll get absorbed sort of back into the main species complex. And you can kind of see the range of even just a single back, like I think the two on the side are just like, this is just Flava across Catsbii, but that's Venosa across Catsbii. They're already pretty close to looking back like their species. And so that's, especially in the Gulf Coast where there's a million different species altogether, that's how they maintain their species differences. Now, this is the complex one that I wanted to go into for the sake of time and sanity. I can't. The phylogenetic summary. Genetics, we have technology. Past the 2000s has been the genetic revolution. We can just do a DNA sequence and compare, or what does that mean? So evolution is understood that everything at some point had a common ancestor. When the two populations were one, that's when their DNA was most similar. DNA, if you know anything about it, is an unstable piece of crap. It accumulates mutations pretty rapidly, and there's unimportant sections that, if changed, nothing bad happens, so those mutate more. If you compare those, you can kind of get a sense. If two groups are more similar, that means they're probably more recent relationship. Where they're very different, probably more distant ancestry. It's stuff like that. It's a bunch of statistics. There's actually kind of a nightmare. If you ever look at all the charts they build have error bars built in because you can get contradictory answers, partly because hybridization turns this into a bit of a mess. And boy, I wonder who likes to hybridize. Other thing is something that comes up in this is the idea of a cryptic species where two things can look identical on the surface, but you pull out the genetics and go, wow, they're really different. So keep that in mind. Oh, okay. So of course, the studies never just look at Purpurea. They're always looking at the whole group, which is why I thought it'd be fun to at least do a quick summary just to get perspective on everything. So first up, when you look at a phylogeny, the joining point, this is symbolic of the common ancestor, where at one point the groups are one, and then they split apart. These numbers are the error rating, the bootstrap value, or so on. It's sort of the, well, the way I heard it in college is literally you build 100 trees. How many trees show this relationship is a way to think of it. One thing too is this also shows the greater relationship. Sarracenia are part of a larger family of Sarraceniae. Sarraceniaceae is a Latin grammar rule that doesn't work out well, which is related to Helianthera and Darlingtonia, which is the lovely detail of they're more closely related to Helianthera in South America than they are to the cobra lilies on the west coast of North America, which is a little surprising. It's also a good way to explain the concept of a basal species. Basal just means base of the tree. It's the longest time separated. Sometimes you'll see that called the ancestral species when that's not quite right. And Darlingtonia is a great example because it's so, like people say, this is what the ancestor looked like, when Darlingtonia is so highly specialized that that's probably not what the ancestor of the whole group looked like. If I had to guess, the ancestor probably looks something like a rubra. Tube, lid, the end, something like that. Anyway, going over, quick family tree tour. The rubra complex is a terrifying mess, like truly scary. Note these low error values all around where it's just like, oh. This, I've heard descent is a area should be here, this, blah, blah, whatever. Takeaways. Leucophylla is part of the rubra complex. When you learn that, it's like, oh yeah, they do look kind of similar. Oreophylla is basal to the rubra complex. What's interesting is if you trace out, it's actually basal to the entire genus. Which means it's kind of the most distant species, which is also particularly funny because it's often isn't Oreophylla, it's often confused with Flava. People often need guides to tell them apart, but if you take a look at this, Flava is on the complete opposite side of the tree. It's as distant of a relative as it possibly can be. Other fun traits in this family tree is Flava allies with the freak complex, Psittacina and Minor, which are the two weird ones with the lids and they're short. It's actually particularly surprising. You know, I talked about how Sarracenia hybridize. Flava and Psittacina are the only known instance where two overlapping Sarracenia do not hybridize. Their flower timing's too distant. People have been watching for it, but no one's actually found a confirmed hybrid in nature directly between them, which is, I mean, that's just fascinating too, because the fact they don't breed, yet the tree still always puts it near Flava. It's like, oh, nice. And then here's our lovely things. This is broadly the tree that kind of adds up. There's always, we'll get into it, but Montana basal, Rosea is kind of distant, and Purpurea venosa is kind of a bit of a nightmare of just, they're close. They're always kind of close. They're always the same. I've heard it put always the same distance from Montana or Rosea. Now, as I get into this is just one tree from one paper, because you know how I said how they hybridize? Yes, that's actually a sighted tree that the paper didn't build. They color-coded it for convenience for when they built their own tree. And instead of lumping the species together, they just put every specimen here. Nightmare. Nightmare. Other detail too, part of the reason this is so severe is this is a chloroplast phylogeny. Not enough time to get into. Those pass mother to mother, their own DNA, which means they're really good at telling if great-great-grandma was a different species, which is why it gets so, oh Lord. Which, of course, in the noise, there are still conclusions people draw from this, generally. There's some interesting stuff here. One, of course, that's fun, is that Montana Jonesii, and somehow an Oreophylla all get recognized as basal. Like if you trace it out, they kind of show up in this entire tree as like just their own distant little group. Which, here's a different paper too, just kind of showing Rosea does actually keep getting recorded as a pretty distant from Venosa and Purpurea, which is interesting because it's considered by some to be a Venosa form. Now, other fun fact, because this is broad, this includes other groups. You actually need outgroups, which are distant known relatives when you build a tree, or you can build it completely backwards. That's a real issue. It's funny, but it's like, you don't want to do that. Fun note, the Ruridula plants are those sticky, weird carnivore things that host beetles in South Africa. The beetles crawl on them, eat bugs, poop on the plant, that kind of thing. Plant eats the poop. Other extremely fun relative, does anyone know what Actinida deliciosa is? Yep, it's a kiwi fruit. I even had to recheck, like, yes, the closest non-carnivorous relatives of Sarracenia are kiwis, which is a little insane. And you kind of, like, the analog to the kiwi fruit is the Sarracenia pod. Like, I guess there's five-way symmetry. I think blueberries and cranberries are nearby too. It's just kind of like, what? Plant taxonomy is insane when you dig into it because it's just full of stuff like that. There's trees everywhere, by the way. Trees have no common ancestor. They pop up everywhere. The closest relative of cephalotus is a tree that's like 40 foot tall. It's like, okay. So yeah, side note, to kind of go into it, this lovely tree was built by combining these three trees of different sections. Nuclear is nucleus DNA, plastid and mitochondrial get passed on mother to mother. They're good references. It's kind of a mess. You still keep seeing Rosea as distant, which is fun to point out. And the whole sort of, I've mentioned, sort of Venosa and Purpurea being seen as, quote, the same distance from Montana, which is interesting. It's sort of, this is just chaos, and just kind of, it's hard to decipher, but you can still learn stuff from it. And so I mentioned earlier, Montana seems to be basal, which despite the morphology struggles, that's really interesting because it means it's the most distant group. It might look like a Purpurea, any other Purpurea, but its ancestry is a little different. Now this is in a realm of like new hypothesis. This is new stuff that kind of, there's no solid papers on it. It's talking with people, comparing a lot of stuff, hearing what they think, hearing what others think. This is the new stuff. Maybe I'm completely wrong. But the emerging idea is that Sarracenia in some way originated, the entire genus originated from the Appalachian Mountains. And that the modern coastal species are post-Ice Age when everything warmed up. You can kind of interpret it as the ancestral ones kind of resided in the coast. And then as things heated up, they retreated to the mountains where it was colder. That's one interpretation. Because as you know, these interesting mountain species that are recorded as basal, Oreophylla, Jonesii got recorded as basal, and Montana, they all reportedly have heat sensitivities. Once again, it's a Florida grower complaint, but it is pretty notable too of like heat sensitivity. Like Darlingtonia and Heliumphora have heat sensitivity. It's interesting because most Sarracenia don't really care about heat. They'll thrive in 100-degree days. So it's just kind of like this little link. Now, as you also might have noticed, every species mentioned here is endangered because the inland environments of these mountains have had the worst land development. They're kind of the worst victim of losing habitat from development. So it's kind of, that's kind of the tragedy. So these truly are, quote, the relic species, the last leftover. Fun note too, not on the map, but Alabamensis is kind of funny because it lives like a relic species, but it's thought to be like, it was like a hot coastal plant that's returned to the mountains. So some like mountain, coast, mountain. That's kind of why it's kind of different, but still kind of acts the same. And that's kind of why this to me is also what's kind of fascinating about Montana, because it's the last sort of remnant of this way of life for Sarracenia, because all the habitat's destroyed or all the other plants have moved on to different lifestyles. And of course, for all that mess, and now we've seen everything, what do we actually call everything? Because this started because there's a lot of dissent on Rosea and questions of Montana. And the answer is, I don't know. It's the labeling is opinion. The phylogenetics are interesting. To me, what matters is you treat them differently, because as we saw, there are those differences. The neat and tidy labeling to me would be 4 subspecies, because it just kind of, it recognizes their separation, recognizes their differences. Rosea has the morphology. The genetics split up a lot of them. There's kind of, as long as they're different is what matters. If you call Rosea a distinct species, I'm not going to fight you. And I'm like, sure, okay. It's notable thing too is there's traditional taxonomy doesn't like, there's something called a paraphyly that Rosea would be, where it's kind of split out at the middle. They don't like it. They like when you declare a group to be all one tidy branch from the base, but also modern taxonomy kind of recognizes that sometimes you do just get a weird family member that becomes so different you can't call it the same. And anyway, should mention this is also my insane ramblings. There's no published source on this specific arrangement. Current arrangement is 2 subspecies and then either 2 varieties or 1 variety and a different species entirely. The only like strong conclusion I'd say is Rosea is probably not a Venosa variety. It's just so different. They probably should be called something else. It's the only one you can kind of tell apart. And that's probably about it for the broad sense of it all. I will say. So, I do have quick bonusing. Apparently, there's new emerging work that, quote, there's these inland Venosas, like the, quote, Georgia Tatnall Venosa, and like some of the Carolina inlands. They make consistently different seeds that are small and shiny. What does that mean? What taxonomic rank is it? I don't know, I'm tired. Basically, it's, quote, being worked on. In other groups of plants, seeds are actually a really big deal for ID. Like sundew taxonomy, and if you ever look into the Australian sundews, the seed shape's a huge deal over there because it's a consistent ID trait. But here it's like, will this be anything? I don't know. If you hear about this in 10 years, you heard it here first. And essentially, we're done here. So yeah, there we go. Yes.
So are you saying we can't send you pictures of our purple? So
You
I
can-
send you and ask which one it is?
You can tell them apart, or like I can try. There's generally, I mean, just do it. You can ID them broadly of just like, because the real issue with Venosa is just, it's more of a fuzzy thing where you can keep finding exceptions between Venosa and Purpurea. But broadly, when you grab a plant, like, oh, that's Purpurea, that's Venosa. Actually, yes, I realized I was forgetting a point that I wanted to go over. People have tried lumping Venosa and Purpurea together. They're like, okay, they're the same. Who cares? No difference. What always happens when people do that is they have to resplit them. They have to even say, this is the northern one and this is the southern one. Oh, so like Purpurea and Venosa? So it's just kind of like, nature's a mess. I can try. Any other question?
Thank you very much, Brian. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I'll have to review my notes and break it down. I like that a lot, and I will send out the slideshow with our minutes.